We're going to try to stick to, there's so much to talk about. I think, I tell this to my class because I teach this course in 6 weeks, but I swear we need months just for one subject matter. So really, there's a lot to talk about. Can't imagine we tried to cover Egypt in an hour and a bit and try and do the same for Syria. So apologize to that. Okay, the Syria panel. Thank you both, Simon and Omar, two good friends. Omar Alghabra is an engineer by trade, but also wants to be a political scientist, just like Wael. Am I right?
I guess so.
Yes. And I say this because he was a member of Parliament, a member of the Canadian Parliament. He is currently also a candidate of the Liberal Party in Mississauga Central. Mississauga Central. He's an engineer by trade, but plays politics, and his most interesting tweets are in politics, not in engineering. And he is also a distinguished visiting fellow within the Faculty of Engineering and Architectural Science at Ryerson University. Omar is a dear friend and has a lot of experience about talking about the Syrian crisis. I'll let him talk about any personal connections he'd want to talk about there. Simon Palamar, also our next door neighbor here at the Balsillie School at CIGI. I didn't have a chance to mention that in addition to the graduate school here, we also have a think tank, an international think tank, the Center for International Governance and Innovation, where I am also a senior fellow. He joined the Global Security and Politics program in 2012. He has a BA in History and Peace and Conflict Study, MA in Global Governance from the University of Waterloo. I did not know that. And a PhD candidate at Carleton University, Nipsia. Was I ever one of your professors?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. No, I didn't. Did I say it out loud? Oh, good. Okay, good. And myself, and we're going to talk about Syria. And I'm going to start with Omar, if I could. You know, we're all watching what's going on in Syria with horror. There's no lack of a better term. Again, I'm being a little professorial here to kind of give context to my students. So it's been 4 years that a small revolution started in the southern part of Syria in a little town called Daraa. And since then, it's really become a national crisis. What could have started off and become, I think, a very small, contained conflict with a small rural community who saw their children being taken by the heavy-handed security apparatus could have been, I think, turned around very quickly, but the government chose to go forcefully and to really turn up the violence in some way to prevent what we saw in Egypt, right? I mean, it was all about preventing the Egyptian scenario where people go in droves to the street. And so the government basically prevented all physical meeting of people in public spaces. It was about making sure that individuals didn't go in masses to the public streets and demand the change in government. So that strategy really turned up the violence. And over the past 4 years, we've seen this awful scenario where it's become increasingly sectarian toned. There are a multitude of different actors. Internationally, we've seen different states support different factions in this fight. And increasingly, Assad is holding on to power with the assistance of the Iranians, with the assistance of Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. Ooh. And Assad is firmly in control in some respects of Damascus, but the country is a mess. We've seen maybe 300,000 people killed. Of that, about 48,000 security personnel of Assad's army. We've seen millions, almost half the population, as refugees of Syria, a country of 22 million. Half are internally displaced, and that means living in public parks, living in schools, families crammed together. And then we have another, 5 million now, maybe a little less, 4 to 5 million externally displaced, mostly in Lebanon, which is a country already quite small in its own, absorbing about 25% of its population as refugees. About 20% of the population of Jordan is now Syrian refugees. Turkey as well, southern Turkey, almost 50% of the population in southern Turkey has now become Syrian. And so the countries around Syria are now also increasingly threatened. So that gives you a little bit of context of what's going on in Syria today. But we're at a crossroads in many respects because there doesn't seem to be a real opposition to Assad that's consolidated and viable. Obviously, we keep hearing a lot about ISIS, which is a terrorist organization that's become very powerful in the eastern part of the country and now has spread into Iraq more recently, creating its so-called Islamic State. I have a lot of problems with that term because it's neither Islamic nor is it a state, but nevertheless, it's become the strongest opposition, at least the most feared opposition of Assad, although there's dispute that perhaps, in fact, ISIS and Assad are on the same page, and basically they've never really fought each other directly other than a few small incidents here and there. But we don't have a viable opposition like we did in the first 2 years of the revolution. The Free Syrian Army, which was at one point the main military opposition to the government, is all fractured. They've all gone, basically moved into becoming civilians. And the foreign recruitment drive, which we'll hear more about in the second last panel talking about ISIS, has really taken over. So I do want to reserve a lot of the ISIS conversation to our second last panel. Of course, that's going to come up. But I really want to get the reflection of both of you on what's going on, in Syria and the issue of Syria internationally. How's it playing out today globally? So starting with the first question, Omar, tell us a little bit about what you think is your reflection of what's happening on the ground in Syria. You're probably the closest out of all of us in terms of being able to tell us kind of what's the mood, what's going on. I have no other term for it other than what's going on.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to join you here today. I guess Bessma referred to my relationship with Syria, so I'll start with that. I am an amateur observer of what's going on in Syria, and mainly because my family continues to this day lives in Syria. And I am of a Syrian background, who was born in the region, but not in Syria. I was born in Saudi Arabia, where my dad was working at the time. So I am following closely what happens in Syria, but not on at an academic level or at a professional level, mostly at a personal level. Let's go back to when the uprising started. I was one of those people who never thought it would ever start. But at that time, there was a tremendous euphoria everywhere in the region. It was just the demise or the end of the Mubarak regime. It was Libya, it was Tunisia, there was protests happening in Jordan and Saudi and Bahrain. There was so much euphoria, there was so much enthusiasm, there was so much idealism in Syria and abroad, but I still never thought, when people were asking me here, is Syria next? My immediate response, with a lot of confidence, saying, no, I could never see that happen, knowing how controlling the regime is, knowing how entrenched the security agencies are, knowing how that Syrians have memories of what happened in the early 80s when there was an attempt at a coup or an uprising that was very brutal and ended up killing a lot of people. So I didn't expect it to happen, and to my surprise, human nature always tends to surprise us. Something started, and it was very organic. It was very natural, and you're right. The regime reacted in a very brutal, aggressive way, and people felt that they could, what was happening in Egypt, that they could duplicate it, and they started breaking through the fear barrier, and protests and rallies emerged everywhere, almost everywhere in Syria, from Damascus to the rural areas, to other large cities, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and certainly Daraa, where it all started. But I feel and I fear that what started as a popular uprising in its fifth year is no longer that. It is no longer organic. It is no longer, frankly, supported by volunteer activists. It's a professional war. Okay. A lot of the players who are active today on the scene are professional. they are paid by somebody. They're backed by somebody. And I don't mean that in a sense of corruption per se. I mean that we're in the 5th year, people need to eat, people need to, or whoever wants to dedicate their lives to changing a regime or building a state or whatever needs to find sources of revenue or income so they can support themselves and their families. And that's where the outside factors stepped in. And now so many different agendas are funding different individuals and different organizations. And by no doubt having an influence on the agenda on the front.
So in political science terms, we call that a proxy war.
Right.
Which is this idea that there are some external backers who are funding militarized or insurgency elements inside a country. So tell us, who do you think, I mean, if you could give us a little bit of background into what you think are the alliance structures right now within the country. Who are the proxy actors?
I think almost everybody in the region, but they in different degrees. So obviously Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, and even Lebanon is maybe it's unfair to call it Lebanon because there are different factors within the Lebanese establishment that are supporting different sides financially and logistically. Qatar, so all of them are supporting either on the ground or political voices on the international landscape. Some of them with an overt agenda, some with a subtle agenda, but almost most of the players right now on the ground or politically are backed by one of these forces or these political establishments.
Simon, you're an observer of international politics, and you study so much of how the regional shifts of power play out in this. What's your take on kind of not just who's supporting who, but why in the bigger scheme of things? I mean, what's the big picture of all of these? I mean, there has to be some bigger reason why, for example, it's argued that the Qataris support Al-Nusra Front, for example. Why specifically these particular individuals? What's their larger aim?
Yeah, great question. Just want to thank you right off the bat for organizing this shindig. It's a nice little change of pace, and I didn't know I was being recorded, so I'll have to bite my tongue a little bit. But I think that
no, it's more fun if you don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
F-bombs
and all. It's all on the internet.
I know where
no
Chris's office is, so I can ask him to edit it after that. No, it's a good question because I think what we have to start out with is, however the war in Syria started, I'm going to go ahead and say that's almost immaterial now, unfortunately. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Omar said, and it's an incredibly messy situation. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty of, who's fighting there, the number of war bands, guerrilla groups, terrorist organizations that have, swarmed to Syria like flies to make it their home. How it started in Dara, 4 or 5 years ago, unfortunately, it's no longer that conflict. It's no longer an Arab Spring situation. It's no longer an arthritic, calcified, Soviet-style strongman who's just losing his grasp on power. It's turned into something far more complex, far stickier, and involves some really ugly trade-offs. And right off the bat, I think we need to discuss and acknowledge that Syria ended up being a much more important strategic asset for the Iranian government than I think a lot of people, even in Western governments who have had bad relations, to put it mildly, with Iran for decades now. I think they underestimated and we underestimated how strategically important that relationship was.
Can you explain it? I mean, can you explain what's Iran's, because Iran is basically supporting the Assad regime and maybe bankrolling Hezbollah and other armed forces to protect the Assad regime. What's the gist of that? Why? Why is the Iranian regime supporting them?
I would need to take it further. I mean, are they supporting the Assad regime? I mean, the Assad regime's practically an asset they've developed and cultivated, particularly in the last 5 years, whereas they had a close and friendly relationship beforehand. Now they've got an essential relationship, and so to get into that, why is that? And there's a lot of debate. If you hang out with folks from the Beltway, Washington, D.C., there are some camps in American politics that really have it in for the government in Tehran for understandable reasons. But I think if you listen to too much American media, Canadian media, British media, kind of lose the picture, because the old irrational, crazy mullahs who, if they get a nuclear bomb, will turn the Middle East into a parking lot in order to bring on the rapture is unrealistic. Iran, think about Iran today like a miniature Soviet Union in 1945. They are in a part of the world where they feel very afraid of their neighbors. They have historical reasons to be afraid of their neighbors. They have historical reasons to be concerned that the great powers of the world will intervene in their domestic politics to whatever extent they feel fit. They had good reason to fear Iraq, which subjected them to an 8-year war that killed millions of people. And the current generation of Iranian leaders grew up during that war. They fought in that war, and they cut their teeth in politics and life during that war. And today their goal is to never allow that to happen again. And one way they never allow that to happen again is to set up regimes, whether they're formal governments, whether they're proxies like Hezbollah, whether they're insurgent groups in Iraq, that are ultimately loyal to Iran, that rely on Iran for backing, for financial assistance that Iran provides. The Muslim jurists there provide them their quota for governing and what the good life is. And Iran has turned Hezbollah, for example, into an indispensable asset. Whereas Hezbollah, in many ways, is an organic organization that came out of some really legitimate Shiite grievances in Lebanon. Hezbollah is also transformed into an organization which Iran can point to as the vanguard against Israeli resistance, which, against Israeli occupation, pardon me, which plays well on the Arab street, which divides some Arab populations in their feelings about Iran. They don't want a unified Arab street behind Arab governments that are hostile to Iran. If they can sow dissension, if they can, divide and conquer, they're much better off. Hezbollah ended up being an indispensable asset for Iran. It keeps Egypt, keeps Jordan, keeps Israel, keeps Lebanon on their toes, muddies politics in Palestine, and has given Iran, great leverage in presenting itself as a legitimate defender of Muslim interests in the occupied territories, for example.
So can I just, sorry to apologize, to interrupt, but again, back to these teachable moments, because I'm trying to keep the class up to date with so much of what we're looking at. So Hezbollah is a political party viewed by the Canadian government officially as a terrorist organization, but a political party that participates in Lebanese politics. And as we talked about in the class in Lebanon, we said that how Lebanese politics is fractured, this idea of confessional politics where we basically divide power along the three groups, Christians, Sunnis, and Shias. Hezbollah basically gets most of its financial and political support from Iran. And if you look at the map, the only way to get supplies to Iran, the most safest way to get supplies from Iran to Hezbollah is the land route through Syria. So one of the arguments has been that the reason why Iran is so supportive of Hezbollah and the Assad regime, or I should say of the Assad regime, is because it gives the land route under Assad access to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is important to the broader Iranian narrative of having a political party or an instigator or a thorn in the side, however you want to put it, a terrorist organization right at the footsteps of Israel, right at the footsteps of the Western, pro-Western governments, be it Jordan, Egypt, and others. Let me ask you, you also, Omar, you've also observed Lebanese politics at this too. The other thing that I think is so interesting, and I'm playing both panelist and moderator, I'm totally abusing every power position I have here. The other thing that's quite interesting is that Hezbollah, its leader, Nasrallah, you could say was one of the most popular Arab leaders, right? So it's gambled a lot on basically choosing sides in this. I mean, it played for a long time because Lebanese territory was occupied by the Israelis, because Hezbollah did instigate and reacted to a number of Israeli incursions or instigated conflicts with the Israelis. It's had this heroic leadership role at a time when practically no other Arab leader would take the helm, right? I mean, and we've talked about this in our class, you know, there's always been that search for this Nasserist kind of character, the one that really played to the cause of pan-Arabism. And Nasrallah was that guy for so long, and now he's chosen sides, I mean, very passionately so. We've heard some of the speeches that he's given recently, making the fall of the Assad regime an existential threat to Lebanon, to not just Hezbollah, but he calls it to the greater, you know, Muslim world. But that's really not convincing for a lot of people who see the Assad regime basically brutalizing its people. What's your take on how Hezbollah has been viewed in this, you know, from the lens of, you know, the Syrian people? What's going on? I mean, is Hezbollah really able to keep Assad afloat? I mean, is there organic support for Assad in the country, or is this all bankrolled by both Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is increasingly playing an active role in Syria as well? I mean, what's the take on the Iranian Hezbollah dimension in the Syrian conflict?
Yeah, there are many dimensions in your questions. There are some support, obviously, for the regime within Syria, whether it is the establishment that wants to maintain the status quo, whether it's minorities who feel that the alternative, and for understandable reasons, they would be at jeopardy and facing some form of genocide if an alternative government takes over, and whether it is the Hezbollah and outside factors as well. So there's no doubt. I feel Hezbollah actually is more interested in supporting the regime. It's the other way around. I feel Iran cares about the Syrian regime for its strategic purposes, less so about supplying Hezbollah, but more about its own strategic long-term interest. Of course, they care about Hezbollah.
Right.
But I think Hezbollah cares more about the Syrian regime for its own survival.
Why?
Because, first and foremost, the supply line. Second, they know who pays the bills. And at the end of the day, they get a lot of the funding from Iran. And that's what happened to Hezbollah. It built a lot of romanticism on the Arab street,
right,
in 2006 and later on. But that romanticism has burst. That bubble has burst because they started seeing a lot of hypocritical rhetoric coming out of Hezbollah, where it called on, I agree with them, rightly so, condemning Saudi for bombing Yemen, but calling what the Syrian regime or what they're doing in Syria as fight against terrorism, etc., which is what the same rhetoric that Saudi uses in Yemen. So there's all kinds of hypocrisies at plays here, and the Arab street now, depending on, I guess, where you line up, because it's been very highly polarized, it sees the regime, Syrian regime, either a fight against brutal Islamism, or it sees the Syrian regime as a brutal force, dictator that wants to kill everybody. Secularism versus theology, or whatever, regimes based on theocracies. That's the word I was looking for. So the street is polarized, and depending on where you are on that side of the argument, you either hate Hezbollah or love Hezbollah.
You know, what I find so ironic, and please both of you jump in on this, is that, you know, when the Arab Spring happened, initially the Iranians were all on board. I mean, they were calling it the Islamic Spring, right? They weren't talking about it as Arab Spring. They were very much like, oh, this is going to be the wave of Islamist regimes coming in, finally, you know. And they could have played that out. I mean, they could have actually, ironically, played that out in some way in Syria, right? In some way, they could have really taken a hold of that. I mean, they saw a potential alliance between them and the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. But for somehow in Syria, it was really interesting that they quickly switched, which shows you that's not ideology, right? Because the Syrian regime is a die-hard secularist. I mean, this idea, I think we really want to debunk this myth that somehow the Syrian regime is a Shiite regime. It's an Alawite regime, yes, but Alawites will tell you that Shiites don't see them as Shiites, right? So there's also this myth that somehow it's a branch of Shia Islam. I think that's a foolhardy one. The Assad regime was proclaiming itself to be this secular, progressive, yada, yada. And the reality is, though, it could have actually taken advantage of the Islamic Spring and been supportive of potentially the so-called Islamist elements of the revolution in Syria. That would have changed the game completely. But, why did it stick so passionately with the Assad regime? Poured not just money, clearly we know there's lots of money going in, but also we know that very early on they sent in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which I know that you're quite interested in as well, academically. I mean, why make that gamble on Syria?
I'll be quick. First, I'm not sure if they made that decision early on. I think they paused for a while. And I think they wanted to see the landscape and how the dynamic goes. And to that extent, I also place some blame on the Syrian opposition early on. They failed to reach out to other regional or domestic forces. They felt that this is, everybody agrees we're going to get rid of the Assad regime. And perhaps at the beginning there was a consensus. Yes, let's get rid of the Assad regime. But then when there was a vacuum of a plan, of an agenda, of a vision,
right,
when there was a vacuum of collaboration, willingness to work together, create space for everybody, I think Iran politically decided that after a year or so that it's in best interest to really bet on the Syrian regime.
Well, but it's interesting they talk with the Syrian opposition too, because I've been a party of these conversations with members of the Syrian opposition who say, it's not our fault, right? 40 years we were in opposition. We've practically never had this conversation because it was so taboo. If you know Syrian politics, and you and I know well, the walls could talk sort of mentality. I mean, people didn't talk politics anymore. If you were in exile, Syrian diaspora that I know were very careful about talking about politics, even in Canada. I mean, it was very, dangerous territory you could get in because the security establishment, as you noted, was so tight. So were we, those of us who sort of, egged on the Syrian opposition, being unfair to them about saying that they should have had their act together and should have had, ironed out all of these internal difficulties when they didn't have really an opportunity to really act as an opposition?
So were we unfair? Yes, but that's reality. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what other people expected, the opposition voices to come out and have some kind of an agenda. Is it unreasonable early on? Yeah, I think it's perhaps unreasonable, but I think it needed some vision, and unfortunately it was lacking.
Yeah, Simon.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what Omar said there, and I think we have to remember that if Iran always had the option of dropping Assad, dropping the Ba'ath Party, and there's a couple challenges there. One, operationally, they need somebody else who they can back. And I think in the early days, there wasn't really an obvious organization they could cultivate that they could put together and help sweep into power. The other challenge is that the Ba'ath Party forced their hand, essentially. As many people have pointed out, what happened in Syria did not start out all that violently. There wasn't violence even on the scale of the early days of Libya, where you started to see some armed organizations put themselves together and start fighting the government. The Assad government, quite rationally realized that if they spark a civil war, if they facilitate a civil war, if they turn this into a crisis, that gives them a free hand, and it gives them a free hand to deal with the opposition as they like. But it tied Iran to them, because when that situation happened, and once you started to see the opposition radicalize or even hints of it, there was no hope to recruit somebody else to fill the void. So that happened very quickly, I think, and may have caught Tehran by surprise a little. Another challenge is we have to remember what was happening in Libya, the rhetoric that was coming out of the U.S. State Department, I don't think was helpful in the early days. There was this kind of talk, and this is, I think this, you can attribute part of this to a change in personalities at the top of the State Department, but Hillary Clinton was, or her advisors or her team, but the rhetoric coming out of the State Department under her tenure was that Assad's finished. As soon as this started, it was going to be a replay of Libya. It's going to be a replay of Tunisia. I mean, it's a matter of days, weeks, months. I mean, he's gone, right?
Right.
Utterly, in their eyes, utterly illegitimate, no popular support, just, a completely artificial edifice sitting on top of this country. It's gone. And the Americans and perhaps Canadians, Europeans may have sold Syrian opposition a false bill of goods and giving the wrong impression, sent the wrong signal in Libya, which was a completely different, militarily completely different situation, not even remotely comparable to Syria, and may have sold them a false bill of goods. And so it's really easy to criticize the Syrian opposition, which sure was not well organized and still isn't well organized, but the hand they were dealt, both by the Baathists and by Westerners who perhaps naively they may have thought were going to provide more support than they did. It's easy to criticize, but I think Assad and his people very adroitly forced Tehran's hand, played really well, caught the Americans far less willing to do anything than the State Department put on.
Well, this takes me to what I think is a good segue to what I think is our next question that we really want to think about. Which is the way Syria is playing out international and regional politics today. I personally can't help but think that Syria's really fallen off the map in terms of priority, right? It's so interesting. My husband the other day was saying, you're on TV almost every day talking about Syria and nobody's calling you now. And I said, well, basically that's the reality of the way the public feels. They're tired of talking about Syria. Governments have no good solution. There's no good end to this. And people are just, frankly, jaded at this point or become immune to conversation about what to do about Syria. It's really sad, but I can't help but find that everybody's kind of washed their hands. And that's been a persistent complaint by many people, both particularly, I should say, in the Gulf, in the Republican Party, and certain elements that want the Americans to have a heavier hand. You talk about the Beltway. When I visit Washington, there's two camps. One that are basically Syria's not our problem. The sort of the Obama administration's view of things. It's let's focus on the home front. Let's ride it out. We've only got how many more months left? Clinton's coming in. It's not our problem to fix it. We don't want to put boots on the ground over there to do anything about it. Anyway, Assad is firmly entrenched in power, so let's get to, Kerry, I think, is one of these people who is starting to say, reality is Assad's here to stay, so let's just talk about how to deal with him. That's the shift from Clinton's time. And at the same time, you have others like probably John McCain being the most vocal advocate of intervention from the Republican Party, although I don't think that's a sentiment carried throughout the Republican Party, because there are many who maybe want Obama to have more cojones, right? They love to sort of blame Obama as being weak. But at the same time, when push comes to shove, most of the Republican candidates are not about being all that interventionist either in Syria. They want us to bomb ISIS, but that's a different topic. So one of the things I'm curious to get your reflections on is really what do you guys see as sort of playing out in this in terms of the international mood? I mean, Omar, you're hopefully, knock on wood, going into the Canadian government. Some of us are happier than others on that potential. What's your take on, how the inside Beltway, inside Parliament Hill viewpoint is on Syria? What are people saying in the political class about Syria?
Well, let's start by first talking about what you just started with, that the media is paying less attention to the crisis in Syria, which is really understandable. Somebody told me it's like when they first invented planes, taking off and landing was a big news story, and they would cover every plane landing and taking off. Today we have thousands of planes landing and taking off, and it's no big deal. And that's unfortunately what Syria has become. It's become a repetitive story, no new angle, no human side of hope or end or any even dramatic stories about it. So it receives less coverage. And when it receives less coverage, particularly in the US or Canada or in the West, then the political establishment is less seized by it because their own population is not writing to them about it, is not asking them to come up with a decision. So it's a self-feeding cycle. Right now, I think there are so many moving parts in what's going on in Syria that I feel Washington does not know what to do. Same applies, I think, here in Canada or most of Europe. It is so unpredictable. It's very difficult to find a horse to bet on. It's very difficult to especially, again, considering domestic political consideration, everybody is waiting to see something and I feel the Iran, US, Europe nuclear deal might shift things, and it might create an opening for discussions about political solutions for Syria. But I feel that is more of a priority, for example, for the American administration than Syria.
Well, and also to add to that, I mean, the Gulf states are vehemently opposed to the Iran nuclear deal with the Americans because they say that'll mean more money in the coffers of the Iranians to therefore fund the Assad regime and fund Hezbollah and actually prolong the civil war. So there's also another sort of downside to that. I think the American State Department, again, back to sort of dissecting the U.S. administration, the State Department is hopeful that perhaps with this deal, they will be able to have some formal communication or trade-off with the Iranians to perhaps talk about these regional issues. But and again, I'm an observer of this from afar, but to me it seems like the Iran nuclear deal has been very tight about the nuclear deal and not about some of these regional issues. Simon, you're nodding, but what's your take on sort of the global or the American warming towards Iran and what this might mean to the Syrian crisis?
Yeah, it's a good question because I don't know how much the United States is warming to Iran. The Obama administration and the State Department really want this nuclear deal. They want it. They really want it. They are bending over backwards. They just told President Obama just signed a bill that will allow the U.S. Congress to weigh in on the parameters of the deal, which reasonable people can disagree about whether the U.S. Congress should have a say over this, but it certainly, I mean, this is a big sop to the opposition, to the Republicans. They want this very badly. And my impression from conversations is that there's a strong desire in state to firewall Syria and the nuclear deal. Any other bilateral issue with the Iranians, also firewall it off from the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal rises and falls on its own merits, and I don't see it opening up a whole lot of room for cooperation between the Americans and the Iranians on Syria. What I do see, I mean, there's a few things that have happened in the last couple of years which I think are good things, and they're maybe not on, at first glance, good things. But one, from the U.S. State Department, we've, because they prioritized other issues, and I fully agree they prioritized other issues, there is now a recognition that whether or not you like Bashar al-Assad, there are people in Syria who support him, whether they support him out of necessity or some other reason, they support him. He represents a big chunk of the population, and he's going to be part of a solution to the crisis, as unsavory as that is. Another good development is perhaps, oddly enough, the invasion of Ukraine, because now Russia has its hands full. And Russia, for a long time, has used some strategic assets, ports and whatnot, in Syria. Syria's a big arms customer. If the Russians saw some sort of proposal that would keep them some influence in Syria, but they might be willing to toss Assad. The sort of emerging alliance between, let's say, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to an extent, in supporting certain Sunni Islamist groups in Syria is probably a good thing, simply because it reduces the number of players at the table a bit. makes negotiations, the possibility of negotiations or doing some behind-the-doors diplomacy just a little more feasible. It reduces the numbers. And, these are all kind of suggesting that, as things happen, there might be some options here. The last little point, the last sort of positive development, I think, is the recent fall of Idlib, city of Idlib, to opposition. What we saw there was, and what it's looking like, the data is fuzzy, but it was probably local battalions that all had connections to Idlib that worked together against the regime, rather than al-Nusra fighting Ansar al-Sham, or two parties, fighting each other. The local battalions in the region seem to sort of throw off their top-level political allegiance and coordinated on this regional level. That creates perhaps more challenges if you end up seeing, an Idlib battalion, a Homs battalion, and they can't agree on what the future of Syria is. But rather than trying to shoehorn various Syrian opposition groups together into the national coalition or something like that, you allow things to, organically play out on the ground. If they figure if a bunch of opposition groups in one corner of the country find a way to work together, well, then run with that. Let them organize themselves instead of trying to herd cats.
Well, this is something that's interesting. The past, probably before 2 months ago, for about a year, we've heard the narrative that the Assad regime is fully in charge, and it's, there's the opposition is in disarray, militarily, politically, and basically the Assad regime is going to win. The past 2 months, we've seen a reversal of that conversation, right? Now we see the narrative that actually the Assad regime looks weak. It's lost Idlib, it's lost Deir ez-Zor. ISIS is strong in the east, and perhaps it's time to think about splitting up the country. This is something that's come on the radar in Reuters recently with a conversation with an unnamed American official. And I think it follows a lot of international processes of the UN claiming that they have some sort of map out there of dividing the country into these zones, basically ceasefires that effectively put the northern part of the country in the hands of the so-called Syrian opposition, give Assad the center of the country, which includes the capital Damascus and Homs and Hama, and the western coast of Latakia, while at the same time the eastern part basically remains a part of the de facto Islamic State, which some argue that the whole fall of Palmyra this past week, where ISIS rolled in and the government forces perhaps retreated with not a huge fight, was all a part of this plan of basically concentrating government forces on the center and the western coast. What's your thinking on this whole divide Syria plan? I mean, we've been hearing it for a while now, right? I mean, I'm trying to remember who first came up with it. I think Joshua Landis was accused at one point of purporting a map. There are all these so-called maps that people have created. Actually, poor Judith Miller, was it, that was accused of at one point having one for Egypt. I mean, people are Biden for Iraq. I mean, all these people seem to have this narrative of splitting up the Middle East, another sort of Sykes-Picot moment of splitting up the Arab Middle East. What's your take on that? I mean, personally, I find it ridiculous because I don't think there's any homogenous region in Syria to really split things. But sorry, I hope I didn't cloud your perspective on that, Omar. But what's your take on, we've heard it for a few years now, the splitting of Syria. What do you think?
I don't know what to believe. I mean, there are so many stories and narratives and conspiracy theories that even the ridiculous one might be accurate, and sometimes the reasonable ones are made up. I'm in favor of something that stops the war at the moment. If there's a way to create some kind of ceasefire conditions for both the regime and the opposition to put some thought into how we can find a solution, because I can't see this militarily being solved. Especially given all the exterior and external factors who have a vested interest in this. And that's why I really don't know if there will be a ceasefire, because this proxy war is being fought by entities who are not on the front line. So it's easy to just supply them with money and weapons and insist on using some romantic notion or notions and let other people fight their war for them. But I feel that as painful as this may be to many Syrians, the idea of, oh, let's divide up the country for now, or divide up the country to create different mini-states, if it leads to a short-term, hopefully eventually long-term resolution, it is worth examining. It should not be just thrown out of hand just because somebody else is drawing artificial lines here, but it's going to save some lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What's your take, Simon, on the potential international support of that? I mean, is that something you think could happen, or could it even happen without having an agreement with the regional and international actors?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because let's look at the country next door, and that's been the grand solution for all of Iraq's problems for I don't know how long now, right? We'll split it up, right? We'll split it up. I mean, I think the people who live there kind of have to figure that out. But I mean, the sort of the glib answer is that it's already like Syria's already split up, on the ground de facto, and I don't see anything changing that right now, because nobody has the preponderance of force that they need to really go on the offensive. We talk about Idlib falling or Palmyra falling. These are not big, huge numbers of soldiers involved. These are not big operations, because nobody has the manpower to really go on the offensive there right now. So I think there'd be tremendous resistance. The United States is not going to okay the splitting up Syria. I think it would be very hard for the Saudis or the Turkish government, I can be corrected on that, to swallow that proposition now after they've thrown so much political capital behind the opposition. A lot of governments are, at least on paper and rhetorically, committed to Syria's borders as they were drawn under Sykes-Picot. That being said, I go back to the point that the country's already split up. I don't think that the Kurds in Syria's Northeast Democratic Union Party are going to give up very easily what they've carved out for themselves, what they've won for themselves in the last few years. I don't think that Christians and Alawites are going to give up very easily their territory to the jurisdiction of what they fear would be a chauvinistic Sunni government. I think it might be possible to, pitch a plan that recognizes facts on the ground, but it will have to be gussied up. There'll have to be some face saving. We'll pretend that it's one country, but some sort of, is there potential for a, what do political scientists like to talk about, a federalized solution for Syria? Probably, just because of the way things have washed out there. It would be so difficult to put it back together right now that might kind of end up being the default option, but selling that and finding a champion who's going to push that process along, that's I mean, I don't know who that's going to be. That's a tough, that's a tall order, I think.
Omar, you on the panel probably have the closest sort of feeling on the ground of how Syrians, what do they want? I mean, what's, if you could just, I always talk to my class about wanting to give them the humanist perspective. I mean, I always start with the top, and then I say we have to end up on the human level of things, because when we start talking about these conflicts devoid of human beings, we really lose sight of humanity and what we're here for. So give us a feeling of what the Syrians, and I know it's a tall order because the word Syrians feels so fractured today, but what is your sense of what you hear, of what do people want?
I mean, I'll tell you what I think, but with a big disclaimer, is exactly what you said. I don't know. I mean, there are other people who will vehemently disagree with me, but I feel the majority of Syrians, even the ones who joined in the protests at the beginning, are now, they want out.
Yeah.
And frankly, even if it meant Assad being part of the outcome.
Wow.
They're tired, they're hungry, they don't have electricity, they don't have jobs, the kids have not been going to school. It is a very desperate situation, and I feel that is a very, very dangerous phase where Syria is at right now. And I think many people are willing to compromise just to get out of the situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What do you think we could be doing more? I mean, I know that you're asked this question often. What can Canada do? What can students do?
You know, everybody claims, or some people may claim to have a magic wand. I don't know what the answer is. I feel for early on, I never supported an international military intervention, unless it was in a peacekeeping form. Peacekeeping form means both sides agree to their presence.
Right.
And I would love to still see that. If there's a way where it's not just both sides, the various sides on the ground are willing to have a ceasefire that is enforced or monitored by international force, I'd love to see that. I'm not sure there is an appetite on the ground there, or is there an appetite by the international community to send anybody there. Also early on, I supported the capacity building initiatives within Syrians. I mean, to the points that we talked about earlier, how much of the opposition politically has been novice and been new, amateurish, because they've never learned, in fact, how to disagree in a meeting, never mind how to pass a resolution in a meeting, never mind how to build a political establishment and an entity. And if there's a way that we can prepare the next generation, as well as, I feel the least we can do is ensure that the next generation who's in refugee camps are not are at least receiving decent education and decent living conditions. Because if we ignore that generation, the Syrian crisis is not going to end, even if there's a political solution tomorrow, because we are growing, or we're witnessing a generation that is growing conditioned on hate and anger.
And if I may add, I mean, just because it's something that it's dear to my heart too, because I've argued very publicly for this, the Canadian government has committed to taking Syrian refugees. We've committed officially to taking 20,000. Only about 200 to 300 have actually made it here. We need to actually live up to our commitment. It's an international problem at this point, whether we're watching Syrians trying to, get on a boat in the Mediterranean, or clearly so many of them in refugee camps around the world and around the region. It's vitally in our interest, I think, strategically, to
Totally agree.
take some of the burden. And so I hope, if anything, if I can make the students into champions, again, back to the human element, is to really write letters. Don't think you guys don't matter. You guys matter. Everybody here in this room has a powerful voice. When you live in a democracy, I remember, I can ask you, Omar, if you remember how it was to be a member of parliament, how many of your constituents really made a difference in your position on things. You really had to listen. So there's an opportunity for all of you to be, I think, little activists here in getting the government to fulfill its commitment on that 20,000. So I'll leave on that note if I could. On that, I want to thank, if we can all give a hand of applause, panelists.